God bless everybody. Today it is July 10th of 2023. We are 3 months from that October 10th date I keep talking about on my paradigm. We'll see how that works out as we move forward. I want to bring you some information. This is starting to move fairly quickly, and we need to see just how this is going to sort of play out in the next 3 months or so. Turkey, in a 180 U-turn, has allowed Sweden into NATO membership. Now, this is pretty unique because if you've been watching him, he's been denying them for over a year at this point. And what's happening here is Turkey is blackmailing Sweden for their gain, because Sweden is doing all kinds of stuff, from changing their constitution to now starting to crack down on these Kurdish people, and they're starting to extradite these people from Sweden to Turkey, which is something they weren't going to do, but Turkey's pressuring them so much through this NATO extension into for Sweden to get into NATO, that we're starting to see them capitulate, and basically Sweden is caving into Turkey's demands. And one thing that's happened is Erdogan's put all these different high bars for Sweden to get into NATO. They've asked them for all kinds of stuff: extradition of the Kurds, to crack down on the Kurds, to stop the Koran burning in Sweden, to do all these things. And Erdogan's been extremely upset over all this, and he's just basically said at one time that he's not going to allow them to get in. And then he upped the bar, and he wants ascension into EU. So he's trying to gain as much possible favor, and he's also trying to negotiate weapons of war and different things like that. So he's going to stay in NATO as long as possible, but I believe that will break down over time. And I believe that this now, because you're talking NATO, basically NATO is banning the Kurds at this moment, and so Erdogan has a free ticket to basically go after the Kurds, as he's been wanting to do for some time. And you're going to start to see, since the cuffs have been taken off, I believe that Erdogan can do basically what he wants. But I also believe that you will possibly see NATO abandon Israel as this plays out. So if NATO is going to abandon the Kurds, and Erdogan's already in the process of genociding the Kurds, now do realize that he is doing a lot of shelling along this northern border. I've talked about all these different areas that you should be watching, especially Erbil and some of these areas. Okay, if you look at the live map, I want to show you this first. You can see there's a lot of activity over here on this area here, and that was extremely important if you watched my video about Gog Mela the other day, that I believe this is where this war is going to actually intensify, is in this area here. And what's going to happen now is, if you look at those Kurdish regions, I want to show you that real quick, you'll see something, at least in my eyes, something extremely important. So you got the Turkish border here that runs along the top here. Now that the Kurds have been basically abandoned by NATO, and Turkey has a free ticket to basically go against them, because who's going to stop them at this moment? Who is going to stop them from genociding the Kurds? We have a small force down in here of 900 and some guys. We've taken all our logistics out of here. Syria and Iraq aren't going to protect these people. So if you look at how this could play out, now that the Kurds have been basically abandoned, they're going to have an issue up in the northern, or in this portion of Turkey, because basically they're not wanted anymore, and Erdogan's going to start to remove these groups from his country. And you've got this border shelling going along here, okay? If this starts down in here like it states, based on Alexander the Great's movements, you've got to go watch the Gog Mela video, then the Kurds, because they feel abandoned and they have no friends left out here, and they feel that Turkey's going to potentially move against them soon. Potentially might cut off this area here in an attack. That would then change the dynamic of this, because in that live map, if you go look at it, there's where all the fighting's happening right now. So the Kurds potentially, based on prophecy, based on Alexander the Great's movements, and how this played out in the past, how it could potentially play out in the future. I showed you that in the last video of Gogmela, that the Kurds could mount an offensive against Turkey, because now they know they're being abandoned, and I have to believe at this moment in time the Kurds are trying to figure out what to do about this, because now Sweden's abandoning them, NATO's abandoning them, Turkey's wanting to genocide them. Turkey's going to get their way because they're the second largest army in NATO, and they have a lot more power on the diplomatic side and through political processes than the Kurds do, and so they're going to get their way here until it doesn't benefit Turkey. If you look at how this could play out, though, if the Kurds would launch a potential attack against this front, because now they're in trouble, Erodgan would squeeze them. And what I mean by that is if you see potentially an attack by the Kurds on either Syria side or Turkish side. Now you got to realize he's got this front covered here. So the Kurds could potentially launch an attack against Turkey in this area here, because their base is over here by Erbil. Okay, that's their capital region. If you looked at the video I did the other day, the Kurds attacked behind Turkey in this area. They actually came behind them, tried to box them out, and then basically Turkey crushed them. In this case, it was the Grecians against the Kurdish. What happened then is, once that fell apart and the Kurds were massacred, they went east, okay, back to their regional area. So they weren't a real problem anymore for Turkey for a while. He's going to come back and finish that portion of the attack later. So if you look at how this could lay out, if Turkey doesn't have any restraint, and the Kurds attack them and then collapse to the east, he would come down into Beirut and take Lebanon and Beirut, based on Alexander's movements of the past. He would go through Israel, through the West Bank. He'd end up in Gaza, okay, and then into Egypt. He could skirt Jordan. He wouldn't actually have to go into Jordan, and he could skirt Damascus also, because he would come into Lebanon, go through Israel, go through the West Bank, end up in Gaza, and go into Egypt. Then, if you look at how it was laid out, he had a little homage being paid down here to where he's like the Pharaoh and all that, because Egypt just basically gives up, capitulates, and just give him control. He finds that he has to come back up to Tyre again in Lebanon, and then he goes straight to Erbil or Gaugamela. That's extremely important, because at this point this whole northern front's being basically bombarded, okay? The Kurds are collapsing down. They've already been destroyed over in this area, and so they're collapsing down. And so when he does this rush attack across Syria and Iraq to Erbil, this whole northern section's already under control of the Turkish army, and so all this would collapse fairly soon and quickly. He'd end up in Erbil, he'd end up in Baghdad, and then he goes to Shush, as it indicates. Now, once he gets into Iran and Iran would fall, then he would come back across and end up in Israel, because he already controls this area. And so he would just conglomerate his 10 nations that have formed at this moment, and Iran now is absorbed in this nightmare. And so he would just bring everything back over to Israel. And it's really interesting that if you go out and you look at my paradigm that I've been talking about, you could potentially see this play out in the next 3 months, because now Erdogan doesn't have any restrictions on what he's going to do. And I believe that NATO will even abandon Israel, as it indicates at the end. No country will come to Israel's aid. If you get into Erbil and they take Erbil out before they get to Baghdad, that would eliminate the U.S. forces there too, because that's where our green zone is. And so we wouldn't have any real occupational presence there anymore. And that could be a potential problem for the United States as that area falls and then we get pushed out of that area itself. And that would then basically abandon Israel to basically be attacked once Iran falls. If you go into my website, my free website, and you go on to endofdayssurvival.com, you come down to these PDFs here, you click on this fourth PDF, you'll end up on my paradigm. Now in the paradigm, it was extremely important that once you get into this area here, we start looking at that October 8th, 2023 date that I gave you based on these prophets and what they had talked about. So if we go into that area, then you realize that when I was talking about this October 10th date, which is 3 months from today, that we potentially would be watching a besiege on Israel itself, or Jerusalem. Now I think this is extremely important that he stipulates this in a very specific way, that he besieges Jerusalem. Okay, well, that means Israel's already being occupied if that's the case, which would make sense, because if you go out to that map, you would realize that once you go into Lebanon, you take Beirut out, you end up in the West Bank, you go through Israel to Gaza, and then to Egypt. Yes, Jerusalem is already potentially being surrounded, and they've already invaded Israel. Would NATO allow this to happen? I believe they would, because they've been voting against Israel for forever, and they really don't support them. And I believe that they consider them under war crimes against the Palestinians, as we've been watching some of this play out in the newspapers and the reports coming out, that basically Israel's considered a terrorist organization itself, that they've been going against these Palestinians and moving these settlements and stuff like this. So in their eyes, I believe they feel that Israel is creating war crimes on these people, and so that would give them justification for abandoning Israel as we move forward. But if you look at that date of October 10th, this is extremely important, because if he's already gone to Egypt and he's already gone into Israel in the next few months, then to get to Jerusalem and besiege them is not a problem by October 10th, because he's already gone through that portion of Israel that would surround Jerusalem, and Israel would be under massive duress. And that makes sense, that if you go back to Joel 1, you would start to see their fortunes wane prior to the sword. And so Turkey's going to go through. He's going to take out the Iranian problem along the border of Israel. He's going to end up in Egypt. That would cause all kinds of problems for Israel and Jerusalem for the next 3 or so months, because he's going to end up in Iran and then come back by October to siege potentially Jerusalem itself. And so I think it makes sense. I believe that the Kurds have been the key to understanding this. And if you go into Daniel, the last 5 chapters, you realize that Darius the Mede has been brought up so many times that we should be looking at this connection, but nobody seems to be doing that. So are we potentially moving into this area of the paradigm here? And would we see potentially this whole area break down over the Kurds in the next few months? Erdogan and Turkey would have the option to basically genocide these people to the point where he has a free ticket to do anything he wants to them. And once they see that first attack and the Medes or the Kurds basically flee to the east, he would go in, eliminate the Iranian problem around Israel, secure that area, go down into Egypt. They capitulate. They don't even try, so that's an easy win for them. They end up back in Gaugamela, which is Erbil, as indicated on the last map I showed you. I could show you that map real quick just so you can see it. So this map is extremely important because this is Erbil, and I think that matters here. But if you look at this map, the war or the first attack would start up here. The Kurds would get smashed. They would go east back to Erbil and towards the regional capital and abandon this area here. Erodgan would come down through, take out everything up to Tyre, not necessarily Damascus, but skirt around Damascus. It doesn't necessarily indicate. He would come down through Gaza and then end up in Egypt. He spends a little time down there, not a lot. He gets a little homage. In this day and age, this moves fast. He comes back to Tyre, and then he does this map. Okay, he comes back through the homes. He comes up around the Euphrates River, around that tomb of Suleiman Shah, up around here. Comes back into the northern portion of this area, which is basically already being bombarded by Turkish artillery up here. He squeezes them down into Erbil, drops them down into Baghdad, into Shush, and that plays out Daniel 8. That would then start into your Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecy, where since he already has this area basically already taken over, he's already in Jerusalem or in Israel, that he could just formulate all of his armies back between these two seas and attack on Israel. So just something to keep an eye on. I believe that this Kurdish abandonment will change the dynamic of the Middle East, and now that Turkey is allowing Sweden into NATO, they will allow him into the EU. And in this process, you'll see two things happen. Both Israel being abandoned and a major attack on the Kurds before long. But I believe that now that the Kurds have gotten the signal from NATO and the world that they really have no friends out here, they will have to figure out what to do about that. And we potentially would see the Kurdish stand armies, the PKK, actually lash out and try to attack Turkey in this corner of the area over here. That ends up extremely bad based on history, and they would then fall to the east, and Erdogan would come down through and take this area first, come back to Iran, and then end up in Israel. And if you go to that paradigm, that would happen potentially before October of this year. So God bless everybody. Let's keep an eye on this one. This is moving fast. Just for Erdogan over the last 24 hours or overnight to change his whole method against Sweden and how they want to deal with the Kurds, and how Sweden has backtracked so heavily against the Kurds, and now how they're working with Turkey. You have to realize the Kurds are under massive duress at this moment, and I have to believe that their governmental organizations are trying to figure out how to deal with this as Turkey gets ready to come in and do something. And that might be the key here. If Turkey goes and gets ready to attack them, Daniel 8 sort of initiates this process. And if you look at how Alexander laid it out, he came down, the Kurds tried to cut him off. That turned out terrible, and when that happened, this whole area collapsed down here, and they ended up actually over in Shush without any real confrontation. It was so easy for Alexander to go through these areas, and he did quickly. So I believe he will do the same as we move forward. Only this will be Erdogan of Turkey. God bless everybody. Have a great night.